I'm going to take, in some ways, a kind of grumpy perspective on some of these issues. And I'm not always grumpy, but I just was on a red-eye flight from San Francisco and just got in, so maybe I'm allowed to say that. I'm calling this piece Corrosive Connectivities in Imperial Times. And two of the points I want to give as a kind of background is exactly that kind of question, Depeche, that Premson brought up, of would we have known it if it wasn't polluted, is very similar to the kind of question that was asked about the Vietnam War. If the middle-class kids weren't going, would we ever bothered to have been in the streets against it? And I don't think that the question is only, would we have known if it wasn't polluted? I think the question is, would we have known if it was only polluting those who were impoverished? I think the question of inequality is crucial to this entire story, and I don't think it's epiphenomenal to the story. I don't think that the distribution of those inequalities and the effects of climate are just par hasard. I think that there are structured kinds of violences that are very much part of it. Sarah brought up already wonderful work of Rob Nixon on slow violence. And the issue about slow violence is it's not violence that is distributed everywhere. It takes particular kind of forms. Its corrosions take particular kinds of forms. So one of the questions I'm really interested in is the politics of knowledge. What we know and what we don't know at the same time. I don't mean sequentially in an Enlightenment moment in which before we didn't know it, oh my God, now it's planetary. Now it's catastrophic. I'm really interested in the fact of not knowing and knowing at precisely the same moment. In what I would call a politics of disregard. It's work that I've done over many years. I'm one of those people who works on the colonizer rather than the colonized, because there isn't just one person sitting there who is not as smart as I am. There's particular practices, dispositions that go into the way in which knowledge is used. So it brings me to a place where I feel as though there is really nothing more to say in some ways. Depeche's amazing talk just now made me think that maybe there's not so much to say, but a lot more to see, where art comes in and why we need art so much. But when I say I feel as though there's really nothing more to say, it's certainly not in this catastrophic mode. I'm not sure that it's serving us. It's like the moral crises of the 19th century. Oh my God, we've got a problem with sex. We've got a problem with morality. Then it goes down, and then it comes up again. Do we need to underscore how much the planetary interconnections that join palm oil plantations in Sumatra, where I did work 40 years ago, to ethanol use in New Jersey are both charging a biofuel outpouring of carbon toxicities at a rate never seen before. It's in the New York Times the other day. You don't have to go to an anthropologist to tell it to you, nor do you have to go to a bioscientist. I say planetary because I think we're all trying to work, what kind of work is this planetary doing for us, rather than global here? To signal the surge of attention to the breadth of damage and degradations, concentrations, words like this are important to me, concentrations and distributions, right, of ecological harm and diminution of defenses across oceanic, earthly, and atmospheric scopes and scales. But the alarms have been blasting for some time, and probably longer than many of us were fully aware. In the mid-19th century, British colonial scientists in India too sounded the alarm. As Mahesh Dangarajan wrote 20 years ago that, I quote, if the government didn't regulate forest use, not only would the land be denuded, but wider climatic changes would follow. That's from the 1850s, right? It's not like the climate is just all of a sudden there. I think as an historian, as an anthropologist, what is the timing of it? What is the historicity of asking the question in this way? As he put it, such warnings were not heeded then, and they're being ignored now. If we are uncovering more deep toxicities than we have ever known, and are just beginning to register that 2 more degrees of global warming will have massive consequence, swallowing coastlines, erasing seawalls, National Geographic loves showing them, flooding urban centers across the world, there is little undiscovered about an array of other tipping points, about the ideology of what was once benignly called natural disasters, floodplains filled with the impoverished. It's not just that there are more floodplains, it's who is set to live in those places. And you can see it in the colonial archives that I've spent 30, 40 years in. The floodplains were not where the whites were. It was never where the colonials were. The floodplains, as the potential for flood, was only where the most impoverished Javanese got to live. Wild fires in Borneo that were never wild, except in the imaginary of those for whom Borneo itself was so. Staged by multinationals, felling trees by the hundreds of thousands, smoke-filled air streams across the Malaccan Straits, with climatic fallout that is no longer dismissed as innocuous fog. Again, we've known about it for a really long time. And even the ongoing environmental ruination of earlier and contemporary empire, what I've called imperial debris, and which one of the things that Sarah probably was interested in having me talk because of that particular work. That is, what is left, but much more importantly, what people are left with and who is left to deal with it. It is increasingly on our collective radar, so much so that 2 earth scientists are making, right now, what for earth scientists is a pretty bold claim, that our colonial past has over centuries altered the eco-balance of the planet. And they write this right now as if this was news, offering the fictive precision of 1610 as a watershed moment, an improbably precise date. The quibble over dates aside, there's something striking and important about the timing, for it coincides at once with what Richard Grove in Green Imperialism names as that moment when, I quote, the damaging ecological effects of deforestation and European plantation agriculture on the Canary Islands, Madeira, Barbados, Jamaica, to name a few, were joined with a simultaneously strikingly keen awareness of the environmental effects of those devastations. It's not they were just devastating and now we're thinking of conservation. Dispossession, destruction, displacement, and conservation were and remain the master tropes and tactics of imperial control and the grammar of governance over people and things in the longue durée. That is, again, knowing and not knowing this is really crucial. A disposition where one is perilously perched between ignoring and ignorance and looking away. Anthropologist Renato Rizaldo's observation that imperialist nostalgia came with colonialism, thinking about temporality again, of course, not in its aftermath. We always think of nostalgia, oh, we're looking back there. No, as they were destroying everything in the Philippines, they were nostalgic, they being Americans, for it. It has ecological resonance, a concern to restore and preserve what imperial pursuits are intent to destroy while they are doing so is the definition of that nostalgia. So it's literally simultaneously. And I was thinking how much we might use that to think about planetary nostalgia as well. that there's this unbelievable kind of affect around the planetary. And I understand some of the intent. We got to move out from the human. We've got to see what humans have done. We have to see our interdependence. But there's something about the kind of cataclysmic quality of it that I wonder if it actually, what it produces. The first museums in China were filled with local art, salvaged as railway construction filled forests and emptied fertile swamps. The two went right together. Such selective conservation and managed restoration turned the colonies into what was very famously in architecture and in art called laboratories of modernity. Not for social reform, as that notion was once feted, but for unfettered experimentation, I would argue, in the segregation of people. The laboratories of modernity are talked about in architectural history as these places where Moroccan architecture mixed with European, and I see it as the segregation of sewage, keeping it away from Europeans, keeping Vietnamese away from whites, displacing people and plantings. These are choreographies of apartheid, that were and are colonial things. I'm sorry, I have to get some water. For these laboratories of modernity were grounded in new forms of governance of people, of microbes, think Pasteur, rubber trees aligned very, very carefully, rice fields etched in herbicides, the latter sprayed and destroyed with Agent Orange in a protracted colonial imperial war. A wholly new socio-ecological regime. That's what I want to hold on really tightly to. Devastating some microecologies and shoring up others for new sources of profit and new kinds of war. Indeed, destruction, conservation, and destruction again, so these are recursive, right? These are not just in some linear form, names an imperial political ecology that outlasts the conferral of legal independence or the formal retrenchment of imperial sovereignty. But these were also laboratories of something else, so wed to the modern, a metric and a sort of sub-metric I've been thinking of inequality, meted out in land, infrastructure, garbage disposal, runoff contaminated water, and polluted air. The precise dating of the Anthropocene to 1610 suggests that empire was an event, but it was not. Imperial formations grew out of well-honed forms of plunder. I always get B's and P's confused. Plunder, I do that in Indonesia, I do it in every language. High finance write-offs, accumulations based on dispossession, degrees of forced labor, from slavery to indenture and back to slave-like manacled wage labor again. They were joined by arbitrary violence, as Achille tells us again and again, and he's so right. Here there is no tidy story of exchange, cotton for rubber, spices for coal. We love to tell that story of the whole sort of imperial network in which everything is being exchanged and between people in a nice, calm way on the market before there's neoliberalism, right? Rather, there are here human bodies rendered commodities, worn out and worn down. Commodities by what Rob Nixon calls, again, the slow violence of decimation, imperial decimation, of tenuously abled bodies. And I underscore that's something we can talk about again, because it's not that they're disabled, they are tenuously abled, the convict labor that was used for so much of the infrastructural growth. So there is a subjacent story that such a search for dating the Anthropocene really marks. It is one deeply wed to the racial regimes on which imperial forms depended, and that was literally constitutive of them. For it was and is not only colonialism and empire as macro-political forms that allowed the global connections to be imagined in a wholly new way, nor is it just futures in coffee and tea in the, well, they were kind of like derivatives in the 17th century mode of global markets that nodded distant places of extraction to new sorts of consumption, bringing the ever-sullied commodities of the modern world, not only within reach, but turning them into necessities. Someone else mentioned this earlier, for a hungry and hardworking industrial working class. For these commodities created new relations of demand and desire that in turn fed more intensive and extensive exploitation. So you can't leave out that story. It's not just an adjacent story. It is a constitutive story. More onerous techniques of extraction, faster extraction. It was a new kind of regime of value, a new computation that more firmly fixed who would be a predator and who would be a prey in a racial regime of empire. Who might be hunted down for recalcitrant work cutting cane, sugar cane, gleaning oil palm, picking tobacco or tea or vanilla for working class and elite consumption. Racial categories, designations, discernments were not minor embellishments that just made the price a bit better for those who craved those things. They were the infrastructural requirements of profitabilities. Racecraft, as Barbara and Karen Fields would call it, provided the scaffolding on which designations of worth and worthlessness, whether of land or people, were made. Such corrosive systems that I worked in and around have tried to understand their logic for some 35 years were built on a set of deeply interconnected principles that transcend, and this I find really interesting, the artifice that distinguishes people from things. Disposabilities of life and labor. It's not that everyone is to be disposed, but the capacity to be disposed of. What are the features that one has to be disposed of? To be available, and there are two senses of this, of disposability. To be available for use, right? You're disposed, you can be used, and disposed to be unneeded and thrown out. 2, the extraction of produce, profits, and labor. And 3, a point which I really feel relates a lot to the earlier talks and that I want to underscore, that I don't think it's that capital just fixes people. I think that what is so nefarious is that it's constituted by managed mobilities. It's that the mobilities are under a regime that has nothing to do with what those people themselves actually want. And those desires of what they want are also part of that larger system. But that managed mobility gets one away from saying either you're stuck or you're there. There are certain times when all kinds of North African men were brought up and they had lots of mobility for the Citroën factories in outside of Paris. And then they weren't needed, and then all of a sudden they became the, sans-papiers. And those people without papers. So understanding how this works, understanding the restriction on mobility, the release of mobility, yes, go. We need to do that history. We need to see how it works, how it operates. We might trace, so these managed mobilities, what I call a kind of calibrated, syncopated movement of response to the ebb and flow of imperial markets, their retrenchment and demands. We might trace their movement and retention by looking to the history of barbed wire, for instance, that morphed what was first used to herd cattle, then in carceral containments, then camps of concentration for refugees and undocumented laborers. And this, again, is not just sequential. It's often at the same time. I'm almost done. Those of us who have sought to transgress the cloistered confines of the academy know that we are on the line to do more, not to say more, but to do more, to think otherwise, to change our practices, and to do better, to put our collective attention on this catastrophic anthropogenic effects that have been unobserved without constantly referring to the catastrophic effects. We have felt the urgency and have been in pursuit, in quest of new nomenclatures. I mean, we're really lacking a vocabulary. I think that's one of the reasons that the Anthropocene and Planetary have been so, and even decoloniality, which is very close to the things that I care about politically. But I feel like it's often just a placeholder, that we don't know what it should look like, what it needs to look like, and who should be a part of it. But now a number of people feel very, I mean, I guess I do too, but it worries me that it remains so empty, and that it kind of confers an authority if one says it. We have felt the urgency and have been in pursuit and quest of this new nomenclature for some time. Names to call this epical drama and trauma unfolding before us. The French philosopher Michel Foucault urged us toward a form of critique that instills and abides by an ethics of discomfort, a diagnostic of our current moment that questions the metrics we use to measure what is working and what is not, that demands new tools of calibration, that calls us to practices that in turn call up new questions that pull our collective attention to the multiple timeframes that matter to our planet, the proximate and the up close, the durability of colonial forms of governance built on extraction of resources and labor and well-being, and those that exceed temporalities in which we live with this planet. The Academy has a strange way of being prescient, and I think we're always too late. I worry about that. The Mandarin Don of French anthropology, Claude Lévi-Strauss, famously lamented his belated arrival in the decrepit environs of Lahore, but more so his belated arrival in the pristine, primitive world. We have long mocked his imaginary, but that doesn't resolve the question as to whether there are better ways to manage the planet and our needs, times when we did not accumulate such mounds of waste. Are we sufficiently mindful of these other potentialities, or are we too late? When I was in Java in January, I watched thousands of military and children spend their Sunday collecting a fraction of the millions of tons of microplastics that were killing the fish, the farmers, I mean, the fishermen couldn't use the rivers anymore, clogged the waterways. They were bold and ready to take on the fight. But were they too late? Too late, as Depeche so rightly notes, because it is they who are among those producing the mounting trash, right? With small plastic wrapped containers of soap and toothpaste. And what Depeche was talking about in the wonderful piece that Sarah mentioned is people buying really cheap air conditioners, right? So that they could live better in a world, but at that same time, those air conditioners are just taking up so much oxygen and taking up really so much, producing so much carbon. I remember in 1972, just a last thought, when I lived in Java. We had only a small woven, low basket in which to put our waste. We were dumbfounded by its size, that couldn't find garbage pails anyway. People didn't have little waste paper baskets in each room. And the clear realization that it was not a waste basket that I was given at all, but it was designed to air and hold vegetables. But people gave it to me. They said, you need to do something with all your paper. They had converted a non-waste into a waste basket for me. It took years to understand how much waste I was producing. Are we similarly too late? Thank you.